living now under the
of empire are fading. Imperial attitudes live on.
Most of us are white in the head, but feel black inside.
Come and integrate, you say. But how can I?
The old idea of empire is repugnant to us today. But the colonies are a legacy which we inherited and which cannot just be thrown off.
An upcoming book that's due to be published in the fall. It's written by a Canadian scholar named Professor Anthony J. Hall. Anthony J. Hall is also the author of a book which is Volume 1, which is the predecessor of the upcoming book which I'm going to talk about tonight. And this is the first volume. It's entitled The American Empire and the Fourth World. It was published in 2003. It's a very interesting text. As you can see, it's about sort of 700 pages. And it's Volume 1, and Volume 2 is the next book that's coming out, and that's called Earth into Property. Colonization, Decolonization, and Capitalism is the subtitle. Tonight I'd like to talk about chapter 5 of that book, which is a very interesting chapter, which I've spent a few days working my way through and think it would benefit listeners and viewers of YouTube to hear about and to learn about. But of course, you must be compelled, some of you, by hearing the title Earth into Property, because of course Earth is something we kind of all have a vested interest in. We all know about. We all have experienced our environment, and our environment has shaped us in different ways. And of course, property, so the transformation of Earth into property, that's a pretty big aspect of human history, I would say. It reminds me, of course, one time this Lord Strathclyde was on the BBC in Britain, and someone was asking him how he acquired his land and how he had the right to his land, and Lord Strathclyde said, well, his ancestors had fought for it. And of course, one working class guy at the back of the room stood up and took off his jacket and said, well, I'll fight you for it now. And you see, that's the case, right? All earth and all property's been acquired through force, through violence, through theft. And I would argue that all wars ultimately have an economic base to them. And so, of course, any professor taking on an issue, this kind of grand narrative of analysing the transformation of Earth into private property requires an economic analysis. In a way, following the money, following who owns what, where, and when, and how did they come into that situation? How did they come to own things? How do certain people become dispossessed, and how do certain people come to be privileged? And is it the case that certain groups in history have an upper hand, and it's maybe why we see certain ethnic groups being privileged and other ethnic groups being deprived? So colonization, decolonization, and capitalism. Of course, with colonization, as George Orwell famously said, imperialism is about one thing, and that's going to other people's countries and stealing their things. And of course, he wrote that in the famous book Burmese Days. And so Professor Hall is a person I know, somebody I know personally, and he's a prolific scholar in Canada, a dedicated and proud Canadian. He's a social democrat, and so this chapter which I'm about to discuss really illustrates that his point of view. He's neither a Marxist nor a capitalist, but he's a social democrat, and he's somebody I know believes in public ownership to some extent. I'm sure he believes there's room for private property to some extent, but of course, how do we get a balance between these two things, between the public and the private, the individual and the collective? And these issues are very compelling. I think that all of humanity has an interest in these things. And also, how do we hold account those with the most force and the most power and the biggest weapons, the most powerful weapons? Immediate countries that come to mind would be the United States, Great Britain, Israel maybe, these countries that have nuclear weapons, as India and Pakistan do also. And how do we hold those in the highest echelons of society to account? And Professor Hall's done a marvelous job of trying to de-talk and deconstruct and demystify these profound issues that really all of humanity has to contemplate, regardless of one's own ideological or political persuasion, or even of one's own status or one's own economic wealth. It's all very well owning stocks and shares in a weapons company, and every time Israel bombs Palestinians, you make a profit from the stocks you have in a weapons corporation, or Sodexo, for example, does all the food for the military and all the universities, and so presumably a shareholder in Sodexo would have a vested interest in war, because if there's a war going on, you need more soldiers are going to eat, and so on. However, I would say that that's all very well until you get a Hiroshima or a Nagasaki, and the nuclear bombs landing on your head or your town. Nuclear bombs generally don't distinguish between wealth and prestige and gender and race and ethnicity. And so I would say we're at a stage, due to the development of the military-industrial complex. That's something Professor Hall defines in explicit terms, this notion of a military-industrial complex. And we've got to a stage where such weaponry is so lethal and so prolific and so dangerous to our species. When I think of depleted uranium being dropped into whole populations and poisoning whole populations, one searches for words to define this. Do we have a word for poisoning groups of human beings, indefinitely? It's beyond genocide, and so these questions I know Professor Hall's in tune with and interested in, and has worked hard in this new text, which I am lucky enough to have the manuscript of, Earth into Property, Colonization, Decolonization and Capitalism. It's due to be published in the fall by McGill Queen's University Press. And so tonight I'd like to discuss Chapter 5. I read it about a week ago, and I read it through again today. And so I'm pretty familiar with the content of this chapter, and it's very, very illuminating and interesting for me. The title of the chapter, this is Chapter 5 of the book, and so it's a 15-chapter book, 1,000 pages. It's, in my view, up there with Das Kapital and The Origins of the Species, and these grand narratives. We're at a stage where it seems in academia, I've just gone through. I've been in Canadian university now in a Canadian institution for 4 years now. I'm entering my 5th year, and I have noticed this kind of, with the postmodern emphasis that goes on in the social sciences and in the humanities, this emphasis on specialization, on making every professor study a specialized and particularized field, which of course is important, and it's necessary that we have that appreciation for the particular in life. But we also need to have certain people who step forward and say, well, what's the bigger picture? How do we string all these together? Charles Darwin did that. Karl Marx did that. And Professor Anthony J. Hall has done that. And I very much feel this book will go down well with members of the public, and that's why I'm motivated to make YouTube such as this, to disseminate the message that this great book, this 1,000-page, like Das Kapital, like Origins of the Species, like Max Weber's works, these big books that draw a bigger picture, that try and encompass and encapsulate many themes, a multitude of themes, and so that's what Professor Hall has done in this work. And so this chapter is entitled Hitler or Roosevelt? Finding Third Ways to the Fourth World. And so that's an interesting title to contemplate. Hitler or Roosevelt? Finding Third Ways to the Fourth World. And so when the fourth world is something that reoccurs and keeps coming up again and again in Professor Hall's works.